You ever get hit with a fine so ridiculous it makes you question the sanity of the system? I did. $50,000 for absolutely nothing. And just wait until you hear how I made sure the ones responsible regretted every second of it. Chris Turner had seen his fair share of challenges in life, but none quite like this. It wasn't the army, it wasn't the construction business, and it definitely wasn't the long hours that wore him down. No, it was the sheer absurdity of what he was facing now. He had just come home from a long deployment, ready to relax, to reconnect with the land he'd fought for, only to find out that the HOA had decided to fine him. $50,000. Why? Because the grass in his front yard was too high. Too high. A mistake, a misunderstanding, he thought at first, but as he sat there, staring at the fine, his patience snapped. The whole neighborhood knew Chris. He wasn't the type to break rules or cause trouble. But this was a line crossed. They were telling him that his property, his pride, wasn't up to their standards. He could almost hear Karen, the HOA president, in his mind, snarking about his so-called unkempt yard while sipping her overpriced coffee. He had kept his head down for too long, always trying to be the good neighbor. But this was something else. He wasn't going to let it slide. It wasn't just the fine, it was the principle of it. They had no right. Not now, not ever. Chris wasn't some pushover. He wasn't the kind of man to let a little bureaucracy tell him how to live his life. So he started to think. He started to plan. Maybe the HOA thought they had power. Maybe they thought they could push him around with their rules and regulations. But they didn't know what they were dealing with. Chris had experience navigating the most complicated systems, from military protocol to the ins and outs of construction permits. And now, he would use that knowledge against them. He wasn't going to fire back with a lawyer. He wasn't going to waste his time in court, paying even more to get what was rightfully his. No, he would hit them where it hurt the most, their water supply. They'd never see it coming. Had studied the system. He knew how the pipes worked, how the HOA controlled the water to the whole block. And Chris wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. The same way they thought they could control him with fines, he was going to take control of something they could never replace. Their water. He wasn't about to destroy their homes, but he was going to make sure they learned a lesson they would never forget. Water. The lifeblood of the neighborhood. And without it, things would grind to a halt. The next step was simple action. It was time to turn off the taps. It wasn't just about getting back at Karen, it was about sending a message. No one messes with Chris Turner and gets away with it. Not anymore. The next morning, the moment the sun crept over the horizon, Chris felt the weight of his decision settle in. The air was still, the neighborhood quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. But for him, this was the calm before the storm. His hands were steady as he sat at his kitchen table, a cup of black coffee in front of him, the plan already formed in his mind. The HOA had pushed too far, and now it was time for them to feel the consequences. He wasn't going to let a group of entitled individuals tell him how to live, especially after the way they treated him. The fine was the last straw. He wasn't about to play their game. Chris had spent years in the military, years learning the ins and outs of strategy, of using what you had to your advantage. Now he was going to use that knowledge to bring the HOA to its knees. The water supply. It was the one thing they couldn't live without. The neighborhood had always been dependent on it and their control over it. But what they didn't know was that Chris had spent the last few weeks quietly researching the water system, watching how it was managed, and learning where he could make a move. This wasn't about causing chaos. It was about taking away their most precious resource, forcing them to recognize that he wouldn't be bullied. That night, under the cover of darkness, Chris drove to the central valve station. It wasn't far from his house, just a few streets over. He had planned every detail, making sure no one would see him, making sure he wouldn't leave a trace. The place was usually guarded, but he knew the shift patterns, the routines of the workers. He had the perfect window. He parked a block away, keeping the engine off, letting the silence of the night wrap around him. Stepping out of his truck, he pulled the hood of his jacket over his head and locked the doors behind him. He wasn't worried about the police. He wasn't worried about anyone but the HOA, what they had done to him. He moved swiftly, the sound of his boots against the pavement barely audible. Reaching the valve station, he took a moment to survey the area. Everything was quiet, just as he had hoped. He crouched low, pulling out a small set of tools from his bag, and got to work. The valve was simple to find, and once he had it, it took no more than a few twists to shut it off. The water to the entire block would stop flowing. No water for the HOA. No water for the homes. No water for Karen. He paused, standing over the valve for a moment, a small quiet smile tugging at his lips. This was it. This was his statement. The HOA had taken something from him. Now he was taking something from them. With a deep breath, he made his way back to the truck, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind clear. He had done it. The ball was in their court now. He just had to wait and see how they'd respond. The next morning, Chris woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing. It was an unusual call, but one he was expecting. He stared at the screen for a moment, then answered it. "Chris, we've got a problem," a voice on the other end said. It was Steve, his old friend and the guy who handled the water systems for most of the town. "There's a major issue with the water supply. The whole block's been dry since last night. No one's got water." Chris leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around the coffee mug in front of him. He could hear the stress in Steve's voice. "What's going on?" Chris asked, trying to sound casual. "Someone's turned off the main valve. The whole neighborhood's been cut off. We've been scrambling to get it back on, but we need to find out who did it." Chris could feel a smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible for this?" Steve hesitated, then said, "Well, there's only one person who could have done this. The new guy on the block. Chris Turner." Chris wasn't surprised. He knew that turning off the water would cause chaos, but he hadn't expected it to happen this quickly. The HOA was bound to be furious. Head made his move, and now it was time to see how they'd react. A few hours later, Chris got a knock on his door. He opened it to find a man in a sharp suit, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Turner?" the man asked, his voice cold and formal. "I'm from the Willowbrook HOA. We need to discuss the water issue." Chris didn't even flinch. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone casual. "Because I'm pretty sure the HOA is responsible for the fine that's being imposed on me. You know, the $50,001. The man didn't respond at first, just stared at Chris with a cold, calculating look. "I'm sure you're aware of the gravity of the situation," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What happened yesterday was a breach of HOA rules. We need you to turn the water back on immediately." Chris stood there for a moment, studying the man, his mind working. He wasn't going to back down. "Erase the thing," Chris said, crossing his arms. "You want the water back on. You'll have to take that $50,000 fine off the table first. And I want a full apology. Not just from you, but from Karen too." The man's face turned red with frustration, but he didn't back down. "That's not how this works, Mr. Turner. You can't just make demands like that." Chris gave a small smile, feeling a surge of satisfaction. "You want the water. You'll have to negotiate. You've got no choice now." The man looked as though he was about to argue further, but Chris wasn't done. "Oh, and one more thing," he added, his voice low. "You and your friends don't get to play God in this neighborhood. Not anymore." The man stood there, stunned, before finally turning and walking off. Chris shut the door behind him, his pulse racing. The first part of the plan was complete. He had them right where he wanted them. Now it was time to see how far the HOA was willing to go to keep their control. The next few days were a blur of tension and anticipation. Chris could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him, though no one dared to confront him directly. He knew the HOA would retaliate, they had to. The water situation was already causing enough of a stir, and Karen was far from the type to back down quietly. But Chris wasn't worried. He had the upper hand now. The phone calls started rolling in. At first, they were subtle. A neighbor asking if Chris knew why the water had been shut off. A quick inquiry from Steve, who was still working with the water system, about whether Chris had heard anything from the HOA. By the third day, the HOA was growing desperate. Karen herself showed up at his door. She was all business, her perfect hair pulled back into a tight bun, wearing a jacket that screamed authority. Her face was tight, her expression rigid as she stood in front of him. "Chris," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I think it's time we talked." He didn't even flinch. "I thought we already had a conversation," he replied, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. Karen gave him a thin smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You know the water supply is a critical issue. You've made your point. But the fine stands. You can't just shut down the water because of a petty dispute." Chris let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "It's not petty. It's about principle. You don't get to fine me $50,000 without consequences." Her eyes flashed with irritation, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're causing chaos. This neighborhood was fine before you showed up. And now you're trying to make demands. That's not how it works." "Actually," Chris said, pushing off the door and stepping toward her, "that's exactly how it works now. You don't get to bully me, Karen. You don't get to run things around here anymore." She opened her mouth to speak, but Chris wasn't done. "You want the water back. You want this to end. Then you'll start by getting rid of that ridiculous fine and offering a full apology. If you want me to cooperate, I want to see you come down from your high horse for once." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Chris could see the wheels turning in her mind, the fury bubbling just beneath the surface. But Karen was a strategist, and he knew she would try to play it cool. "You're playing a dangerous game, Chris," she finally said, her voice tight. "This isn't over." "Oh, I know," Chris replied with a small smile. "But I'm not the one who's going to lose in the end." With that, Karen turned sharply and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Chris stood there for a moment, watching her go. The first move had been made. Now, it was only a matter of time before the HOA would have to face the consequences of their actions. He wasn't finished yet. Days passed, and the tension in the neighborhood continued to rise. The water issue was still unresolved, but Chris wasn't backing down. Karen had tried to pressure him, but she wasn't used to dealing with someone like him. He had a plan and he was sticking to it. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to scramble, trying to fix the problem while keeping up their facade of control. But Chris knew that their control was slipping. The cracks were beginning to show. One afternoon, as Chris was sitting in his living room, reviewing some documents, his phone rang. It was Steve again. "Chris, they're getting desperate," Steve said, his voice urgent. "Karen's making some serious moves now. They've filed another set of violations against you. And this time they're threatening to take you to court." Chris wasn't surprised. He had expected this. The HOA couldn't just let things go. They needed to save face. "What are they charging me with this time?" Chris asked, leaning back in his chair. "Some kind of water supply tampering claim," Steve replied. "They're going all in. And they've got their lawyers on it. They're serious about this one." Chris let out a long breath. He knew this was coming. They weren't going to just back off. But he wasn't worried. Had been through worse. And this time he was ready. "All right," Chris said, his tone calm. "Tell them I'll see them in court. But they better be ready for what's coming." He hung up the phone and sat there for a moment, the gears in his mind already turning. It was time to escalate. Chris wasn't going to just defend himself. He was going to hit them where it hurt the most, right in the pocketbook. Over the next few days, Chris carefully prepared his counterattack. He called in favors from old contacts, used every bit of knowledge he had about local laws, and pieced together a solid case. He wasn't going to play their game. He was going to turn the tables. The HOA wanted to take him to court. Fine. But they wouldn't be expecting what was coming next. As Chris prepared, he noticed the first signs of the HOA's panic. Karen was suddenly more visible, trying to smooth things over with neighbors, putting up appearances that everything was fine. But Chris saw through it. He knew she was trying to cover up the cracks in her authority. By the time the court date arrived, Chris was more than ready. The courtroom was filled with the usual tension, the smell of polished wood, and the quiet shuffle of papers. Karen sat across from him, her usual smug smile replaced by a tight-lipped expression. The lawyers for the HOA were already talking big, throwing around legal jargon that Chris had seen before. But he wasn't intimidated. He had done his homework, and this time the HOA was playing on his turf. The judge entered the room, and the proceedings began. The HOA's lawyer launched into his argument, but Chris could already tell it wasn't going to be smooth sailing for them. Chris stood up when it was his turn. He wasn't just going to let them spin this in their favor. He spoke clearly, methodically, laying out his case. He had the facts, he had the evidence, and he knew the law. The HOA lawyer tried to interrupt a few times, but Chris shut him down. He wasn't here to play games anymore. By the time he was done, the judge was looking at the HOA's case with skepticism. Chris didn't need to say anything more. The damage had been done. As the judge deliberated, Chris could see Karen's face. It was no longer the smug, confident look she had when she first walked in. It was a look of worry. The tables had turned. Chris had them right where he wanted them. As the minutes passed, the silence in the courtroom grew heavier. Chris stood there, hands clasped behind his back, watching as the judge leafed through the papers, clearly considering his arguments. Karen, sitting at the other end of the room, couldn't seem to shake the look of unease creeping across her face. The once confident expression had now been replaced with a tight-lipped grimace. The lawyer for the HOA was still speaking, but Chris could see that he was losing ground. The case was crumbling, and there was no escaping the truth anymore. Chris had done his research. He had anticipated every move they could make, and each one was falling apart. The HOA lawyer fumbled through his notes, trying to find a way to salvage the situation, but Chris could tell it was too late. The judge was already starting to piece together the holes in their case. "Mr. Turner," the judge finally said, his voice calm but firm. "I have reviewed the materials you provided, and am afraid the evidence is clear." Chris nodded slightly, a sense of relief beginning to settle in. Karen's lawyer, however, didn't seem ready to admit defeat just yet. "Your Honor, I object to the claims being made. We believe the defendant's actions were in violation of several community regulations," he said, his voice trembling just a little. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. I understand your objection, but the fact remains that the HOA did not follow proper protocol when imposing such a fine. This fine of $50,000 was excessive, and there is no concrete evidence to support the water tampering claim. Chris could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. He had played the game by the book, and now it was clear that the HOA was out of their depth. The judge looked up from his notes and addressed Chris directly. Mr. Turner, I find that you acted within your rights. The HOA will be required to drop the fine, and I will issue a formal warning regarding their behavior. The room fell silent, and Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction washing over him. Karen's face was now a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She had lost. And now she was going to have to answer for the way she had treated him. Thank you, Your Honor, Chris said, his voice steady. He wasn't done yet, but this victory was sweet. As he walked out of the courtroom, he could hear Karen's voice rising in anger behind him. This isn't over, Turner, she shouted. Chris didn't even turn around. Yes, it is, he muttered under his breath as he left the building, the weight of the battle finally starting to lift off his chest. The HOA had pushed him to the limit, but now they were the ones who were going to pay the price for their mistakes. As Chris stepped out into the bright sunlight, he couldn't help but feel that the war was far from over. But for now he had won. And that felt like a victory worth celebrating. The days after the court ruling were quieter than Chris had expected. It was almost unnerving how fast the tension seemed to drain from the neighborhood. The HOA had been silenced, but that didn't mean Chris was ready to let his guard down. He knew this wasn't over. Karen would regroup. She always did. Still, there was a certain satisfaction that came with winning. Walking through the neighborhood now, he could feel the weight of every stare, every whisper. But they didn't dare approach him. The once imposing power of the HOA had been shattered, and Chris knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks would start to show. A few days after the ruling, Chris got an unexpected call. It was from Steve, who had been keeping a close eye on things. Chris, Steve's voice came through the phone, low and urgent. You won't believe this. The HOA's trying something else. It's not over. Chris' heart sank. What now? They're digging deeper into your property records. It looks like they're trying to claim the land around your house. They're threatening eminent domain. Chris stopped in his tracks, the world around him suddenly feeling much heavier. The audacity of it all. They had already lost, and now they were trying to take his land. Eminent domain. Chris repeated, his voice incredulous. Are they serious? Dead serious. They're trying to find a loophole, something to use against you. They've got lawyers looking into every angle, Steve said. It's all over a stupid piece of land they think they can take control of. Chris' mind was racing. He wasn't going to let them do this. They had pushed him too far already. If they thought they could come after his land, they had another thing coming. I'll deal with it, Chris said, his voice calm but filled with determination. Keep me posted. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, research, and planning. Chris knew that the HOA wasn't going to back down quietly. They had their sights set on his land, and they were willing to go to any lengths to take it. But Chris wasn't going to let them win. He had spent years learning how to navigate complex systems, how to fight back when the odds were stacked against him. Now he was going to use everything he had to protect what was rightfully his. Late one night, as he sat at his desk, a stack of property records spread out before him, Chris found something. It wasn't much, just a small detail hidden in a batch of old documents. But it was enough. The land the HOA was targeting had been deeded to him under a special clause, something the HOA had missed. It was the key to stopping them. Chris' heart raced as he studied the clause. This was it. This was the leverage he needed to push back. The next morning, he called his lawyer and laid out the plan. With the evidence in hand, he was ready. The HOA had no idea what they were about to walk into. The final battle was about to begin, and this time, Chris wasn't going to just defend his property, was going to make them pay for every inch they tried to take. The next few days felt like a slow-motion storm, the tension building with every passing hour. Chris had the leverage now, but he knew this wasn't going to be as simple as presenting the evidence and walking away. The HOA wasn't going to give up without a fight. They had underestimated him before, but this time he wasn't going to let them slip through the cracks. He had already arranged a meeting with his lawyer to go over the next steps. Armed with the key clause in the deed, he was ready to strike back. The evening before the meeting, as Chris sat in his living room reviewing the documents, he could hear the distant hum of traffic, the neighborhood peaceful, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but it wasn't fear. This was different. This was control. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The next morning, Chris walked into the lawyer's office with a quiet confidence. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just defending his land anymore. He was setting a precedent. As his lawyer reviewed the documents, Chris leaned back in his chair, eyes focused. His lawyer looked up at him, a surprised look on his face. Chris, this is big. This clause gives us a solid foundation to challenge the HOA's claims. They never saw this coming. Chris didn't smile, but a sense of satisfaction washed over him. They never do, he muttered. Let's get it to court. It's time we end this once and for all. The lawyer nodded, already starting to make preparations. Over the next few weeks, Chris and his legal team filed motions, presented their case, and prepared for what was to come. The HOA fought back as expected, but with every move they made, they exposed more of their own weaknesses. The day of the hearing arrived, and Chris felt strangely calm. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as both sides prepared for battle. The HOA's lawyers were well prepared, throwing out accusations and trying to undermine Chris' case, but he had the evidence. The deed clause was ironclad, and every argument they made seemed weaker in comparison. Chris' lawyer spoke confidently, laying out the case step by step, highlighting the flaws in the HOA's claims. And then it was Chris' turn. He stood up, his voice steady, his eyes focused on the judge. Your Honor, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to protect what's rightfully mine, he said. The HOA has tried every tactic to intimidate me, to take what's mine, and now they're trying to use legal loopholes to take my land. But the truth is clear and the law is on my side. As he spoke, Chris could see Karen and the other HOA representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. Chris knew that this wasn't just about winning the case. This was about setting things right. The judge called for a brief recess, and when he returned, it was clear that the tide had turned. After reviewing the evidence presented, the judge said, his voice firm, I find in favor of the defendant, Mr. Turner. The HOA's claims are dismissed, and the fine is hereby voided. Furthermore, the actions taken by the HOA were not in accordance with the law. Chris couldn't help but feel a small smile tug at his lips as the judge's words sank in. The battle was over. And this time Chris had won. The HOA was left to lick their wounds, their plans shattered, their power broken. Karen sat in stunned silence, her face pale, as she realized that all her efforts had been for nothing. Chris had not only protected his land but had also exposed the true nature of the HOA's overreach. As Chris walked out of the courtroom, he felt the weight of the victory settle in. He had fought for his property, for his rights, and he had come out on top. The HOA might have been the ones with the power, but now they knew better than to mess with Chris Turner. As the days passed, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the neighborhood. The weight of the victory was still fresh, but there was a calmness to the place that he hadn't noticed before. The tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud was gone. The residents of Willowbrook Estates were going about their business, some with cautious glances in his direction, others with obvious relief that the HOA was no longer the overbearing presence it once was. Chris knew that the HOA had tried to break him, tried to make him bend to their will, but in the end it was their arrogance that had led to their downfall. They had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just for protecting his own property, but for showing everyone that they didn't have to live in fear of the HOA. As he stood on his porch looking out at the quiet street, Chris thought about the future. He had made a point of standing up to the HOA, but there was more work to be done. He wasn't just going to rest on his laurels. There were other neighbors who had been pushed around, intimidated into silence, and he wasn't going to let that continue. The battle had been won, but the war for justice was ongoing. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure that the kind of thing the HOA had tried to do to him didn't happen to anyone else. Chris had learned a lot from the experience about the law, about standing firm, and about the power of using your voice when you feel oppressed. But most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the best way to fight back is not with force, but with strategy, with patience, and with the knowledge that you are on the right side of history. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Weeks turned into months, and as the seasons changed, so did the neighborhood. Chris had become a quiet force in Willowbrook Estates, known as the man who had taken on the HOA and won. The others respected him for it, but more importantly, they knew they didn't have to be afraid anymore. They could fight back too. One afternoon, as he was walking down the street, Chris ran into an old neighbor, a man who had lived in Willowbrook Estates for years but had always kept to himself. The man smiled at him and gave him a nod of approval. "You know," the man said, "I've lived here a long time. I never thought anyone would stand up to them. But you did. You showed us that we don't have to just take it. Thanks for that, Chris." Chris smiled back, a simple nod in response. It was moments like this that made everything worth it. The HOA had thought they were untouchable, but Chris had shown them otherwise. And now there was peace. True peace. The kind that only comes from standing up for what's right.